There's an interesting case here about a pharmacy known as Tailor Compounding. Their CEO was convicted of unlawful distribution of unapproved drug. And the drugs specifically cited in the DOJ report were BPC 157, cerebrolysin, CJC 1295, Talon, ipamorelin, and several others. Their CEO was criminally prosecuted and found guilty. Several of the peptides have been specifically flagged by FDA as, quote, significant safety risks. Under U.S. law, it is not legal for a pharmacy, physician, or clinic to prescribe, dispense, or otherwise facilitate the human use of an unapproved peptide. In the United States, a consumer who obtains an unapproved drug and takes it is generally not committing a crime. And then I think it's worth thinking about, what are you hoping to get from the peptide? What's the best outcome you might get? What's the worst? What do those extreme outlier potential cases look like? And are you prepared to accept those cases? Hey everyone, welcome to the Optispan podcast. On today's episode, I'm going to talk about peptides. I know everybody is interested in peptides these days, but unlike other episodes, which are important, I'm not going to talk so much about which peptides are, most efficacious, have the best safety or the worst safety, which are going to be beneficial for longevity or not. I'm going to talk about the regulatory environment of peptides. And I know you're probably thinking, oh my God, this is going to be so boring. Hopefully it won't be, but this is something I've been really interested in. Like, what's allowed? What's legal? What's illegal? What's the gray area? I didn't know the answer, so I tried to do a deep dive into the laws and the regulatory framework and really kind of understand what's going on in this space. And so I'm going to do my best to communicate that to you in a way that isn't completely confusing, because it is honestly pretty confusing and messy. So to start with, though, let's just kind of create some definitional groundwork. What is a peptide? A peptide is just a molecule that contains two or more amino acids connected by a polypeptide bond. Peptide bond is just a specific type of chemical bond. Okay, so based on that definition, all proteins are peptides or polypeptides. In conventional use, peptide typically refers to just a shorter version of a protein or polypeptide, usually in the 20 to 100 amino acid length. And typically these shorter peptides or polypeptides are going to have kind of a looser three-dimensional structure. So they're not big enough to fold into a particularly stable structure. But the reality is this definition is wishy-washy. There is no defined cutoff in size or shape. So, I think for today's purposes, it's okay to just think of peptides as a class of proteins, and they're pretty much interchangeable within that regulatory framework, or at least the length of the peptide isn't a key defining feature for how these things are regulated. It's also useful to appreciate that peptides and proteins are simply one class of biologically active molecules. So other classes would include DNA, RNA, small molecules, glycoproteins, antibodies, cell therapies, things like that. Each class of therapeutic has its own strengths and weaknesses. All of them can have potent biological activity, and that activity can be good or bad. So peptides and proteins are just one of many types of biologically active molecules. So one question, sort of fundamentally, I think some people are wondering about is, are peptides regulated? Are they even regulated by the FDA? Because they're sure all over the place, and many of them are not approved. And the short answer is yes. The long answer is also yes, but they're regulated somewhat differently than some of the other types of biological therapeutics that are out there. So some peptides are regulated under a framework called the U.S. Public Health Services Act. And so these are typically going to be what are known as biologics. And these include, and this is a quote from the FDA literature, a virus, therapeutic serum, toxin, antitoxin, vaccine, blood component or derivative, allergenic product, protein, and then there's this carve out, except any chemically synthesized polypeptide or analogous product, applicable to the prevention, treatment, or cure of a disease or condition of human beings. Okay, so that carve-out's important because some peptides are naturally occurring. Many are chemically synthesized. And so if it's a naturally occurring peptide, it's regulated under this framework. If it's a chemically synthesized peptide, it's still regulated by the FDA. It's just regulated under a different framework. So chemically synthesized peptides are regulated as drugs under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And so this is going to be the same regulatory framework as the vast majority of medications that you're probably familiar with. Metformin, rapamycin, statins. These are all regulated as drugs under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act because they are chemically synthesized. Okay. So in general, it doesn't really matter when, for the stuff we're going to talk about over the next 15 or 20 minutes, which framework these things are regulated under, but it is worth knowing that they're regulated under these different frameworks. So this chemically synthesized framework includes peptides like the GLP-1 agonists, Wegovy, Mounjaro, things like that, SS peptides, BPC 157, ipamorelin, tesamorelin, CJC 1295, and a bunch of others. That's because they are all chemically synthesized. They are not naturally occurring. They are considered drugs by the FDA and regulated under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Okay, so you may be wondering, why did Congress even set up this crazy sort of framework or two different frameworks? And really it's because at the time the legislation was being written, biologics were considered sort of messy and chemically synthesized drugs were considered cleaner, more uniform, easier to characterize. And so they just created two different frameworks for the regulation and approval process for these different types of potential therapeutics. So one thing to appreciate here is that regardless of the regulatory framework, peptides have to be approved in order to be legally dispensed by pharmacies and by physicians. So until they receive an FDA approval, they are considered unapproved new drugs, just like any other pharmaceutical. Okay. And that means that if they're not approved, it is technically illegal to market them for human use, sell them as supplements, prescribe them unless there is an IND, compound them, unless they are FDA approved or they are part of what is called the bulk drug substance list. So we'll talk about these things, but that's the take home. Okay. If they're approved, they fall in one bucket. If they are not approved, they fall in this other bucket where it is, again, illegal to market, sell, prescribe, except in rare carve-outs, or compound them. Is it legal for a medical doctor to prescribe a peptide? Is it legal for a compounding pharmacy to compound a peptide? And is it legal for you to take a peptide? Okay, let's dive into all of those questions. Again, fundamentally, it doesn't matter if a peptide is natural or synthetic. The key distinguishing feature here is it FDA approved versus unapproved? Some of the FDA approved peptides include things like multiple GLP-1 agonists, GLP-1 GIP dual agonists like tirzepatide, insulin, growth hormone, tesamorelin, SS31, IGF-1, and several others. Okay, those are in the FDA approved bucket, meaning that they have been approved for some human use for some specific indication. If FDA approved, then a physician can typically prescribe that peptide, what's called off-label, for other use. In that context, prescribing peptides for longevity medicine or functional medicine as an off-label prescription is typically legal. Compounding pharmacies sometimes are allowed to compound it, but generally they're not allowed to compound it unless there are patient-specific clinical differences from the approved branded product, right? Meaning somebody's got an allergy, they need it in a non-standard strength, they need some other form of delivery, maybe a patch or liquid versus solid, something like that, where there is not a standard formulation available on the market. Or in some cases, like we have with the GLP-1 drugs, there's a temporary drug shortage and FDA says we're going to temporarily allow the compounding of this pharmaceutical. Outside of that, compounding pharmacies typically aren't supposed to compound approved drugs for standard use or for bulk use. That's called protocol-driven compounding. Technically, that is illegal, but also rarely enforced. And that'll be a theme that we keep coming back to, rarely enforced. Okay, so if a compounding pharmacy is compounding illegally within this framework of an FDA-approved drug and a physician is prescribing it, who has the risk? Again, typically rarely enforced. The compounding pharmacy is going to have the highest risk. The physician clinic probably isn't at much risk unless they are somehow conspiring with the pharmacy to market this FDA-approved drug in bulk. Again, patient, really minimal, no legal risk to using an FDA-approved drug that is illegally compounded outside of the potential health risk that goes along with a compounding pharmacy if it's not a high quality compounding pharmacy. So those are the FDA approved drugs. That's pretty straightforward. FDA approved, legal to be prescribed off label. Some questions around compounding, but as long as it's a legitimate, reputable compounding pharmacy, probably not much in the way of risk there. So what about the bigger bucket, which are the unapproved peptides? And many peptides that are in use in longevity medicine and functional medicine fall into this category. There's a pretty long list, but it includes things like BPC 157, TB 500, thymosin beta 4, sermorelin, ipamorelin, CJC, MOTS-C, humanin, epitalon, FOXO4, DRI, any clothopeptides, thymosin alpha 1. There's a bunch of these things, okay? And then any stack or mix that includes one or more of these unapproved substances would also be considered unapproved, even if it also has FDA-approved components in there. So those are all going to be, again, regulated the same way. The legality will work pretty much the same way for anything that is unapproved. And again, here it's pretty straightforward. Under U.S. law, it is not legal for a pharmacy, physician, or clinic to prescribe, dispense, or otherwise facilitate the human use of an unapproved drug or peptide outside of rare edge cases. These are rare, but they do exist. It may be the case that the peptide or drug is under an active FDA-authorized investigational new drug application, IND. There may be a clinical trial here. Participating in the clinical trial under that IND is allowed. It might fall under expanded right to try laws, but those are so new that I don't even know of a single test case yet. And there it might be legal at the state level and not at the federal level. Otherwise, illegal for a pharmacy, physician, or clinic to facilitate the human use of any unapproved peptide. Okay, but it's happening all the time. So why is that? So it's important to understand this legal question is irrespective of intent. Is this wellness versus treatment? Irrespective of patient consent, irrespective of whether the peptide is compounded, and irrespective of whether harm occurs. That doesn't matter. We're talking only specifically about the legality. And again, I want to make the point. This is not a question of morality or ethics. I'm just talking about what is the law. You may have heard of this thing called the bulk drug list. There was this sort of rumor going around that for some of these peptides, it was okay for compounding pharmacies to compound some of them because of this bulk drug list. And so what is that all about? So I did my best to try to figure this out. And it turns out that under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, compounding pharmacies can sometimes compound drugs from bulk drug substances if they appear on FDA's 503A or 503B bulk drug substances list. So if a bulk drug is on that list, then under certain conditions, compounding pharmacies are allowed to compound those drugs for human use. The short answer here is that, to the best of my knowledge, that I was able to find, absolutely none of the unapproved peptides are on either list. And given that, it is not legal for compounding pharmacies to compound them under the bulk drugs substances list. And in fact, it's a little bit even worse than that in that several of the peptides have been specifically flagged by FDA as, quote, significant safety risks. These include BPC 157, AOD 9604, CJC 1295, and ipamorelin. Now, I'm not suggesting that those are actually significant safety risks. I'm just saying FDA has explicitly flagged them as such. So as far as I can tell, none of the approved peptides fall into this carve-out for the bulk substances list. So if that's the case, then why do some compounding pharmacies feel comfortable compounding these things if they're not on the bulk substances list? And I think there's some history here. There's a little bit of nuance. So for many years, the FDA allowed pharmacies to nominate bulk substances to be included on these lists. And FDA reviewed them very slowly, like FDA does seemingly everything very slowly. And so during this review period, they often exercised sort of temporary enforcement discretion, meaning they allowed pharmacies to compound these things while they were going through the review process. I frankly don't understand in which cases this was allowed, in which cases it was disallowed, but they did allow it in many cases. And so this created some ambiguity, this sort of limbo state where pharmacies learned to operate inside that ambiguity. And some pharmacies became comfortable compounding substances that were under review, but not yet approved or on the list. Still not legal, but not enforced and kind of allowed. And there was a general understanding that this was okay. So that's my take on why this is still happening. FDA has sort of said, stop doing this. And so most compounding pharmacies have stopped, but some still feel comfortable operating in this ambiguous situation. Okay, so again, I'm just going to restate the legality. Under U.S. law, it is not legal for a pharmacy, physician, or clinic to prescribe, dispense, or otherwise facilitate the human use of an unapproved peptide outside of rare edge cases which do not apply to the peptides being used in longevity medicine or functional medicine. That's the legal situation as I understand it. Now, just because an activity is illegal, that doesn't mean it's not common or accepted. And I think we can all think of many examples in society where this is the case. Think about driving your car, right? Nearly all of us break the letter of the driving laws from time to time, but nobody really worries about having your license revoked or going to jail for minor infractions. Is this a similar kind of situation? I don't know. It might be. I think in some ways it is, or it's at least perceived as such among portions of the medical community, the biohacker world, and I think growingly the general public. So there's a gray area here with peptides, right? Just like speeding in your car. Maybe both are illegal, but there's a big difference between, I don't know, rolling through a stop sign or going 75 miles per hour in a 70 mile per hour zone versus doing 75 miles per hour in a school zone after blowing a blood alcohol level of 0.2, right? Society treats those things differently. And I think that's probably true in the peptide world as well. So in the peptide world, the gray area lies around, likelihood of enforcement, degree of potential harm, whether harm actually occurs, and these sort of nebulous and shifting cultural norms within this slice of the medical community. If everybody's doing it, it's probably less likely to be prosecuted, probably less likely to cause serious harm. There's also levels of nuance in other dimensions, right? Skin formulations are typically believed, and this is true, to be much less risky than, say, oral or injected formulations, which are less risky than IV formulations. FDA-approved drugs, but illegally compounded, probably closer to the 5 miles per hour over the speed limit than using unapproved drugs and illegally compounding or prescribingly. Commonly used peptides are less risky than newer fringe therapies. Pharmaceutical grade, way less risky than research grade. Peptides with some human data, way less risky than no human data. And so the degree of severity of the infraction here varies based on many, many different factors. So given that, it's illegal, often not enforced, sometimes enforced. Who's at risk? So the primary legal liability sits with the compounding pharmacy or the distributor of the peptide. The clinician and physician also has some risk. Patients themselves generally have little to no legal liability. So with pharmacies, the penalties can range from warning letters from FDA to product seizures to injunctions, loss of license. In serious cases, DOJ does sometimes get involved, and that can lead to criminal prosecution. Does happen from time to time. There's an interesting case here, if you want to check it out, about a pharmacy known as Tailor Compounding. Their CEO was convicted of both unlawful distribution of prescription drugs as well as unlawful distribution of unapproved drugs. And the drugs specifically cited in the DOJ report were BPC 157, cerebrolysin, CJC 1295, epitalon, ipamorelin, and several others. So I don't know the details of this case, but it does point to the fact that a compounding pharmacy that was making some of these commonly used peptides in the space was subject to DOJ action. Their CEO was criminally prosecuted and found guilty. Doctors do have some risk here as well. Most common, the enforcement is going to be at the level of a state medical board. Certainly, if a patient is harmed, civil malpractice, it's pretty hard to defend yourself against malpractice if you're prescribing an illegal and unapproved drug to the patient. It's pretty uncommon, I think, for FDA or DOJ to get involved, and really that probably would only happen if the physician is involved in some sort of systematic or commercial criminal activity, oftentimes maybe conspiring with a pharmacy to sell these things in bulk or something like that. Patients, in general, have little to no legal responsibility if you are taking a prescribed, unapproved peptide. So it's not saying there's no risk, just not legal risk. Risk to your health is a different story. In summary, two types of peptides. We can break them down into FDA-approved or unapproved. Again, this is going to be true for other types of drugs. We're just talking about peptides today. So legal for a licensed medical professional to prescribe an approved peptide off-label. Compounding could be legal or illegal depending on the situation, but that's going to rarely be enforced. Never legal to prescribe or compound an unapproved drug for human use outside of these very rare edge cases. So which cases are like driving 5 miles per hour over the speed limit and which are like drunk driving in a school zone? That's the gray area. And it feels like it's a bit of a moving target right now. So what about those of you who might be self-sourcing peptides on the internet? In general, in the United States, a consumer who obtains an unapproved drug via the internet and takes it is generally not committing a crime. The exception to that might be if it's coming from outside the United States, in which case you may be breaking some FDA importation rules. Again, enforcement here almost always targets the seller and not the consumer. In the US, a consumer who obtains a prescription drug, so this would be an FDA-approved drug via the internet without a prescription, might be committing a crime, maybe is often committing a crime. This is going to vary somewhat by state and whether the drug is controlled or not and what level of controlled substance it is. That said, again, overwhelmingly, enforcement targets the seller, not the individual consumer. You're more likely to be targeted if you're a consumer and obtaining a prescription drug without a prescription for bulk distribution to other people, of course. Okay, so I already talked about the take-homes around the legality. For patients and consumers, rarely face legal consequences. Worth saying that the health risks are real, and those can come either from the active ingredient or from impurities that sometimes show up, particularly in the compounded formulation or in research grade drugs that people may buy. So these risks are going to increase with the more experimental or newer peptides, with stacks. If you're sourcing without a prescription, the use of peptides that FDA has flagged as significant safety risks, and the use of research grade materials. So just be aware of that. Okay, so that's sort of my understanding of the legal situation around peptides. I'm just going to leave you with some final thoughts. Again, these are more thoughts than anything else. Just as a statement of fact, we are at a place where many doctors in the functional medicine and longevity medicine community are comfortable illegally prescribing unapproved drugs in the form of peptides. That's not said with judgment. It's just a fact. Some of them, though not all of them, know that it's illegal. So I think there's some confusion among physicians around the legality of what they're doing. Many patients also don't realize that it is illegal or that the peptides are experimental and that they often come with limited human data for safety and efficacy. It is the case that conventional norms around practice and enforcement can change, right? They're in one place today, they can be different tomorrow, and the direction and rapidity of change can vary, right? So what is accepted today as normal practice may be prosecuted tomorrow. What is prosecuted today may be accepted tomorrow. And I think those changes happen especially if and when behavior becomes extreme or serious harm becomes frequent. And I think many people are feeling that in the current environment now, the behavior around peptides has certainly ratcheted up about 10 notches. I don't know if I'd describe it as extreme or not. That's going to depend on your personal perspective, but it's certainly gained volume. So we may be at inflection point where regulation and enforcement are likely to change rapidly in the coming months or years. So for you as an individual, I think everybody needs to consider their own risk tolerance, right? And what they want from their physician. Do you want a physician who follows the law to the letter of the law? Do you want a physician who's willing to bend the rules if they believe that it's in the best interest of their patient? Do you want a physician who's willing to bend the rules all the time? Does your physician know the law? I think these are just questions to think about, maybe talk with your physician about. And then again, I'm pretty libertarian in my views when it comes to healthcare. I think people who are informed should have the right to do what they want with their bodies as long as they're not harming other people. But I think it's really important to ask yourself, what's your knowledge base? How informed are you? How able are you to make a fully informed, rational risk-reward decision? And in the case of peptides particularly, do you know the quality and the source of the peptides? How confident are you in the quality and the source of the peptides? Do you know the real data on safety and efficacy of the peptides? Or are you relying on others to know that for you? Are you just trusting people, and should you be trusting those people? And then I think it's worth thinking about, what are you hoping to get from the peptide? What's the best outcome you might get? What's the worst? What do those sort of extreme outlier potential cases look like? And are you prepared when you do the risk reward analysis in your own head to accept those outlier edge cases? So those are sort of some of the ways that I'm grappling with this issue, thinking about it. We're going to do a whole series of upcoming episodes on individual peptides and try to talk a little bit more about what's actually known, so that if you're thinking about taking these peptides or stacks of peptides, you can maybe have a little bit better information to base your decision on. So hopefully you found that informative. I know I learned a lot going down this rabbit hole, and boy, it's like the tax laws. Wouldn't it be great if we could kind of reform the way FDA is operating to just be a little bit more efficient and make a little bit more sense? But nonetheless, we are where we are. Hopefully that's clear enough in terms of at least the legalities and the likelihood of enforcement. And as always, welcome any comments or questions, or if I got anything wrong, please let me know. Some of these things aren't completely clear in even the FDA literature itself. If you're not yet a subscriber, please hit that subscribe button, and I hope to see you next time on the Optispan podcast.